Cool, we'll get started then. Hi, I'm John Campbell.
I'm Katie Good, Creative Director.
And welcome to Having a Smashing Time Together. It's a talk about the trials and tribulations of developing the asymmetric multiplayer we have in Smash Hit Plunder. Could you, oh, I forgot I've got a clicker. Cool, so before we start, who are we and how did we get here? We are both quite experienced. We've been in the games industry for quite a while. We've worked at a bunch of studios you may or may not have heard of, like London Studio, Natural Motion, and Frontier. We've always been looking to create new experiences that don't fit into nice, neat genres. Things like augmented reality with the Wonderbook on PS3, and then we also are lucky enough to work on the new wave of VR devices right at the beginning, and we work on internal prototypes at Sony that would eventually become things like VR worlds. Eventually, we decided to go full indie. We quit our jobs, and we moved to Cornwall and set up a new studio, Triangular Pixels. Our first game wasn't really supposed to be our first game. Valve ran a little invite-only VR jam in London, and this was when they were ramping up for the HTC Vive. And we managed to get invited to that, and we wanted to see really how far we could push room-scale VR. We had a really cool little prototype, and then we put another 6 weeks of development on it, and we ended up with Unseen Diplomacy. And this was an installation game that we had running over a week at the Game City Festival in Nottingham. It was super short, and it was a bit rushed because we were trying to get it done for this festival. But it went down really well, and everyone at the festival really enjoyed it. And that was pretty much going to be it. We weren't going to release it past this one festival. But actually, Valve really liked it, and they asked us to put it on Steam. And it was a thing we weren't sure on doing because it was quite short and rushed. Eventually, they convinced it it'd be good on Steam, though, and it went down really well. Hi. I did new things in VR, and it pushed things to its limits. And that's always been our goal for the future. Games that give players new experiences and things that they can't get from other games.
So this is why we're here today. This is Smash Hit Plunder, which is actually the game that we've been working on for the past 4 years. So Unseen Diplomacy taking 6 weeks. This one is obviously much, much bigger in terms of scale and scope. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was make something that really felt like a full title. So it takes me so long to speedrun. It takes me like a whole day to speedrun the game. It's got loads of levels. It's got a full single-player campaign. And the idea is that you're supposed to run around, smash everything up, looking for treasure. And so if you're old enough to remember Finders Keepers or Supermarket Sweep, the TV series, then you know roughly the sort of feel that we were going for. The other thing that we really wanted to do with it was actually make you feel like you're inside a video game. A lot of VR titles, they have really realistic graphics, and that's cool, and it makes you feel like you're on a beach or you're in space. But you know what, like, at some point I might be able to go to space, but I'll definitely go to a beach at some point in my life. But when I was growing up, what I wanted to do was go inside a video game, and VR was really a chance to be able to do that. In terms of the actual gameplay as well, the interactions themselves, even though this isn't rendered realistically, all the interactions are. So if you find something that's wooden, like a wooden hammer with a metal top on it, you can put that into the fire. The handle will set alight, but the actual top won't because it's made out of metal. You can set fire to something and then carry that around the level and set fire to everything else, things that are made out of wood or food. And of course, the core of the game is smashing things up. And smashing things, turns out, is really, really fun because in VR, you don't have to tidy up afterwards. That core set of interactions on the first prototype went down really well at various events. It's something that players obviously really enjoyed. But when we started showing off the game, what we had was a Gear VR as a prototype device, and you couldn't see what was happening when people were playing. It's on a mobile VR device, where's the image is going to be going to. So for Game City back in November 2014, we created a companion app for the PC, which lent the Gear VR to be able to stream the data to the PC, and then we rendered on the PC like a 2D version of the game where we could see the map and where the player was, what they were looking at. And we found this much more awesome to look at than the normal VR view. It doesn't make people feel sick while watching them because, amazingly enough, you can stick a GoPro on someone's head and they're moving their head around all the time. That's horrible to watch, that footage. Whereas this, it actually allowed people to join in, that sort of asymmetrical information. People on the outside could see behind the VR player and was telling them to move around and check this out and check that out. And it was like this whole cool family event of everyone looking at the TV rather than just seeing someone gawping around in VR. So when we moved away from our prototype to actually start working on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 4, fortunately, allowed us to be able to actually have something different rendered on the TV. And so this is where we started getting really cool with Smash Hit Plunder, where the person in VR can see this first-person view that was, as you see in the bottom right, that allows them to walk around the dungeon, what you expect in any sort of VR game. But in the top left is the view that you actually get on the TV screen. This lovely isometric view, which we actually based off Super Mario RPG, if you remember that back on the SNES, which really does, when you see that view and then you put on the headset, it really does make you feel like you're inside that game world. However, when you're actually rendering these two entirely different screens, there's a lot more work you can possibly imagine that needs to be happening.
For a start, one of the biggest changes to when we have to start showing the separate screen is now we have to show a representation of the VR player from outside. So we need a VR avatar. Unlike a traditional game, the VR player can move in lots of different ways. They're not restricted to pre-made animations on a control pad, but they can move their head and their hands into whatever positions they want to be in. And we need to build a VR avatar that tracks their movements, tracks them fluidly. It matches the position of their head and their hands, and it has to move believably, and it has to move well, look good. So here's the avatar we ended up with. This is being controlled by tracked head position and a pair of controllers. We had to be really careful to design the avatar to make it work well in VR. For a start, we don't know if the player is male or female, so we designed this to look acceptable to either. And whether you're playing a game, the avatar is you. We want people to identify with it. Secondly, the game has no idea where your feet are. Now, unless we want to start strapping controllers to players' feet, we're going to have to take a guess. But instead, we can kind of cheat, and we can cover them up with a cloak, and that makes it a lot more believable as to where these feet may be. Similarly, elbows for VR avatars are really hard. The shoulder and wrist joints are actually really, really complicated joints with lots of degrees of freedom. So your elbows can actually be anywhere. Instead, we've designed the avatar so that the elbows are kind of implied and your brain fills in the rest. And a little bit of maths makes the cuffs of the gauntlet point towards the kind of the general elbow shoulder area. And because we knew the avatar would be seen from a distance on this social screen, we have to make it big and chunky so it's easily read. And this is what it actually looks like under the hood. Only the head and the hands are known directly. Everything else is calculated from relative positions of between those and kind of what the game thinks you're probably doing. We know what kinds of actions the player's going to do, so things like picking up, leaning over, crouching down. And so the main pose is based on which of those we think you're doing at the moment. And then we add in secondary actions. Secondary actions like the tilt of your shoulders and the sway of your hips come later on, and these are layered on top based on where we think your center of mass is. And then finally, there's a little bit of a tail connected to their feet, and that's based on their previous movement. And that's how we drive the cloak that kind of trails behind them. In many ways, for us, it was important not just to be accurate, but to look believable. So a lot of this is calculated in a way that it never kind of glitches and pops and snaps around, even if that means sacrificing a little bit of accuracy occasionally. Because really, we want it to just look smooth and consistent on the TV screen.
So the way that you actually start building an environment for VR is obviously you would go into a room and you'd have to have all four walls, the floor, and the ceiling. But in an isometric view, you need something completely different. So the first thing you need to start thinking about is the different sort of information you have to display on each screen. So some of the things that we had to alter was, the most obvious thing is to actually take away the roof, take away two of the walls, so you can see into the dungeon on the TV screen. So these are still things that are rendered in VR, but we turn them off using layers in Unity for the social screen camera. The next thing that we also have are what we call fadeaways. And those are bits of geometry which the VR player and the social screen player need to be able to see, but are things that we need to be able to see behind as well. So we have like a nice sort of diver effect, so they sort of look semi-transparent. The next thing that we have is the actual wands for the VR player. Now, for the VR player, when they look down in first person, those are realistically proportioned, they have all the buttons and all the UI that they need. But if we had that on the social screen, they'd be tiny, like really, really, really small. You wouldn't be able to see them, and they'd be really noisy as well, because all the crunchy little detail on them. So we actually totally sort them out and have them really big and chunky so that the people watching the TV screen can actually see what the VR player is pointing to. Of course, with the extra TV screen, we can have UI that we don't necessarily need to show the VR player as well. The really different one, which you might not notice, is the fact that these red floor mats are actually only seen on the TV screen. And the reason for that is, in VR, you just don't need them. When we're looking around a room, it's easy for us to see a door because it takes up a big area of our screen space, or our eye space, I guess. But in this isometric view, it's only really the top two doors that you can see. The bottom ones and any other ones in any sort of strange angles are really hard to see. So we actually put on these floor mats that you can only see on the TV screen. So we had this lovely TV view, but the other thing that we noticed with like majority of VR games is actually VR is really antisocial. You are literally strapping someone into VR, blindfolding them, taking away from the room, potentially even putting headphones on them, so they just can't interact with anyone. So it can be quite an insular experience. So we wanted to turn Smash Hit Plunder into a local multiplayer game. And thinking about this, the VR player obviously has these amazing controllers. They can see in VR, interact with 3D space, they can point, move anywhere, and sort of sense the control they have is much better that you get using a pad. They also have depth perception, which obviously you don't really get on a flat screen. 3D TVs have been and gone. That wasn't a thing. So if we wanted VR players to be interacting with the TV players, suddenly we're having to balance people using pads on a flat screen with VR players able to move their hands anywhere. So to make it fun with everyone, we know that we have to start going down this asymmetrical multiplayer route, because naturally the hardware forced our hand in that. If we try to make the VR player and the social screen players do the same things, it wouldn't necessarily be fun for either of them. It would feel nerfed, it would feel unbalanced. So for inspiration, we started looking at things like the Mario Party series. It showed us that it is possible to have players with totally different objectives playing with each other and enjoying each other's company still. It was also interesting to see the 3 versus 1 modes that they often have. And more often than not, they were actually surprisingly unbalanced, but they still had fun. It was still fun playing with them. And Pac-Man Versus is another great example. This is a game that came out on the GameCube a long time ago, where on the TV screen, you had everyone playing as ghosts. But if you connected up a Game Boy Advance to the GameCube, you actually had a little screen that you could use where it would be Pac-Man, which I'm surprised they didn't actually bring this out in the Wii U. It would have been a great fit. But what we found with this one is the fact that the TV players had completely different information that the little GBA player had. So it's quite interesting, this idea of information asymmetry, we called it, where one person has a lot more knowledge of the game map than the other people. And it's a great fit for VR, naturally, because of the different views that you get. And another source of inspiration for us was Mario Galaxy. What we loved here is the fact that the second person can help and join in with the first person. They could just drop in at any point. If the kid is stuck, you just help them in the level. And this sort of co-op, this asymmetric co-op, was actually something we quite enjoyed and liked. However, what we also saw was the fact that when we were creating something for Smash Hit Plunder, we wanted it to be substantially more than just wiggling a move control around and collecting through Lumas.
So for Smash Hit Plunder, continuous theme, we created the goblins. And the goblins are additional player-controlled characters who help the VR player in co-op modes, and they fight against them in the multiplayer modes. They've been designed to be kind of small, friendly creatures, because we kind of don't want these big, scary creatures chasing down the VR player. Their short height also means that the VR player can see over them, so they're never really obstructing your view, and they don't get in your face too much. Goblin characters play along on the TV just like a regular game. They get an isometric view of the game, something like this. But they're not limited to staying in the same room as the VR player. They can go anywhere else in the dungeon that they want to. So they might choose to go ahead and explore, scout, and see what's up, and they can warn the VR player of any upcoming hazards, or they can stay with the VR player and help them smash items and collect loot. Again, we want players to have a character they can relate to, so the VR player feels like their friend is right next to them in VR and in these dungeons. So we have a mix of goblins of different personalities and different genders, so hopefully everyone can find someone that's a good match for them. This also helps in multiplayer where there might be 3 different goblins roaming around.
So the TV controllable goblins can be played in any mode. So we do have this very long campaign. We have the drop-in co-op. So if you have someone with you, they can come in on the TV screen at any point, come and play with you as a normal character would, and if they don't want to carry on, then they can just come out at any time. You don't have to quit the level or anything like that. We also have 2 multiplayer modes as well, and it's really these modes that are the trickiest to design. So for different multiplayer modes, we have to think about the sort of different information that the players are going to be seeing. We found that some kinds of information is actually really difficult to share with each other. So, for example, if I'm a buddy trying to describe to someone, like the VR player, where I am, a position is really difficult. It's quite a lot of information. It's like, I'm next to this tree that's in this field, in this position here. It's not just a GPS coordinate that we can give people nowadays over a mobile phone. Whereas if you tell someone what time it is, that's just a number, and they know what that is, and then they have all the context for that number. And humans don't just use their voice to communicate either. We're always using our head, our eyes, our emotions, our hands. So the VR player, that's fine. They've got their head, they can move around, they can point. But for the TV player, they don't have that. They've only got a gamepad. So we had to give them the extra tools to highlight things. So they can jump, they can throw things, they can move things. But they can also have a torch to highlight things. And people end up having their own ways of communicating. So as well as using their voice, they can basically emote using their controller too. But the actual multiplayer modes themselves, especially with these different abilities, the players themselves we had to think about how we're going to balance all this. But with VR, we do have this advantage that there's no such thing as screen peeking anymore, which you're used to having GoldenEye, where you could see what other people were doing. We're just looking at the other corner of the screen.
So eventually, we had this thing where the game of hide and seek is actually a really good fit for multiplayer VR. And we went one further this, and we ended up with Poltergeist. And this became Poltergeist Panic. This was our first of the 2 multiplayer modes we have in Smash Hit Plunder. The VR player is an invisible ghost, but their actions can still be seen on the TV screen. So goblins have to look out for strange behavior, levitating objects, objects being smashed, and hunt down the VR player like that. Meanwhile, the VR player is trying to free their caged ghost friends. They have to be sneaky and cause just enough chaos to be able to free them, but not so much that they're obvious and they get caught by the goblins. Now, the first pass we had at this, the VR player just had a score. And they had to reach that score, and the buddies had to stop them. It worked, but it wasn't as good as it should be. The VR player had to keep stopping to check their progress, so it made it kind of a bit stuttery. And the VR player could just hang around in one room, and they could complete the entire mode just in that one room. There was no impetus to explore the dungeon. And because it was just reaching a score, games would just kind of finish. It would just stop when it reached this point. There was no build-up to the climax. So how we changed this was we instead made it a per-room score. So we added caged ghosts as a representation of whether any given room had been won or lost. And this is also handy because it's an in-world representation. So people don't have to keep checking their HUD or other information. You can just instantly see it. As well as this, because it's per room, this forces players to keep exploring and keep moving. They have to win multiple rooms rather than just staying in the same one. And because it's the first to free these ghosts, it means the game naturally ramps up to a climax, which is much more fun at the end. Originally, we didn't even have a time limit, which means the games could really drag on a little bit. We did add a time limit, but then most games ended in a draw. In addition to this, the goblin players could pick up all the loot, and that could lead to this weird stalemate where the VR player doesn't have enough loot in the level left to even win. So we changed a few things around. Now a timeout is a win for the buddies, and this puts more pressure on the VR player to actually get out there and create chaos. And we took away the buddy's ability to pick up loot. So now, if loot's out there, the VR player can grab it. And leaving loot lying around is now kind of a strategy the VR player can have. This puts a lot more pressure on the VR player to win, and then we rebalance to take these new things into account. As a result of this, the game kind of naturally comes to a climax in the last 30 seconds, and it gets super intense, which is great.
Of course, now that players are playing with each other, they're going to be coming against each other. So how do we deal with the combat? One early mistake that we actually made was allowing the player to pick up the buddies and throw them away, which caused havoc with our locomotion code, but we dealt with that. And it was amazing fun as the VR player. You just picking up these creatures, they're squirming around, and you just hit them against the walls, and you felt really powerful, really cool. However, playing as the goblin, it felt horrible. Like, I couldn't get near the VR player, I couldn't interact with them any sort of way. And if it was just 1v1, it was impossible for me to get near and do anything with them. So we actually took that out completely. So what we actually changed to instead was this mechanic of just picking up and smashing things. That's what you're doing for the rest of the game, so why don't we just do that in order to combat each other as well? So it fits in with the context of the game. You can just pick up something and throw them at the buddy or throw them at the VR player. The buddies themselves can't actually die. They get stunned for quite a long time. And they can just pick up something and throw it back, or they can catch it and throw back. And it keeps things fast and chaotic and rewards players for doing the thing that they should be doing throughout the whole game anyway. The game is fundamentally about smashing, so smashing is how you win in either case.
So when we found that smacking VR player or indeed the goblin players over the head was a lot of fun, we also found at the same time that stealing items from each other and kind of wrestling for control over something was great fun as well. So this is where we started from when we made our second multiplayer mode. So Duel, players must find the hidden jewelry box. It's hidden in Grandma's room, and then fight for control of it, and then be the first to give it to Grandma to score its valuable contents. Then Grandma moves on to another room, and the action begins again. And then the first person to win 3 rooms wins the mode. As this mode came later, we had a better idea of what we were doing, and we knew it would be fun. Instead, the biggest problem we had for this was actually figuring out a context and a setting for the actions we wanted the players to do that made sense. So we originally had it where players were hunting keys to unlock a treasure chest. However, keys they're small, they're fiddly, they're tricky to see on the TV screen, and they're just generally not that fun to interact with. Really, we wanted something more kind of chaotic and unpredictable, like a kind of a bouncy ball. So we switched the concept round. Now players are looking for the treasure chest, and Grandma has the key. But now we have this problem that we've got to deliver this chest to Grandma. And Grandma's a small character, and she doesn't take much space. Throwing in VR, it can be difficult to be super precise, especially under pressure in a multiplayer mode. So we needed a way to make it more forgiving. Also, throwing around treasure chests at Grandma, it's not intuitive, and don't throw things at your Grandma. But lots of sports have goals or nets that balls are thrown into, and that's a much more intuitive thing for players to grasp. So a large net solves both the problems of the accuracy and the size as well. So now when the treasure chest is found, Grandma knits a net for you for the players to throw the ball into. And this also has the nice side effect that now Grandma can take a few seconds to knit that, and that really amps up the anticipation of trying to score.
One of the least obvious problems that we found with a lot of the levels was actually the viewpoint that we had isometrically would work in single player and in the co-op, because the camera would chase around the TV player and always stay focused on that. So we can always swap out, take out those rooms and take out those walls that were not needed. However, in multiplayer, when you've got 3 TV characters walking around, some levels just fundamentally didn't work. This, for example, is one of our levels, which is quite early on in the game, but it's over multiple floors. So it feels like a real house that you're exploring and moving around in, and it feels great in single player, and it feels great in co-op. But in Versus, it's not going to work, because you can see if people are on the top floor and the bottom floor, how are we going to show the bottom floor for the other players? They're going to get the people are going to get in each other's ways, and various walls are going to get in the way of each other. So what we ended up doing was, rather than trying to wrestle around with trying to change all our levels to work with Versus, we ended up tailoring specific levels for Versus modes instead. And for that, we could lean back on more traditional games that you would see, like these maps in Half-Life or in Counter-Strike and things like that, where they're very designed so you can loop around each other, you can backtrack on each other, you could have places to hide. And especially in our VR mage, in our Poltergeist Panic mode, where the idea of the game is to go and hide and do things, if we just gave you a linear level, it would be so obvious where you are, because at some point you'd have to, if you want to get to the other side of the level, you would have to pass everybody. So we had to put in all these loops. The other thing that we did was we did make them bigger, but we also made them more condensed. So they're in a much tighter space. And in a lot of the rooms, we actually put in obstacles in the middle of the room as well. So if you felt like you were caught in a room and all the doors are being blocked by people, you at least got the table to walk around or a pillar.
So there's lots more that we could go into, but we really don't want to spoil the game too much. We've had a lot of fun putting lots of different kinds of interaction and supporting lots of different play styles. And that's something that's best experienced firsthand. Smash Hit Plunder is out on the PS4 on October the 5th, so just in 2 weeks. Or you can come and visit our stand in EGX. We're just at the front of the Republic of Gamers bus. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? No?
Doesn't look like it. Cool. We'll be around if anyone wants to ask us anything individually. But yeah, thanks for your time, guys.